Today, The Update is honored to be speaking to Allan Little, a former BBC journalist and special correspondent. He has worked as a reporter the world over, including in Baghdad, Johannesburg, and Moscow. Allan Little, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Pleasure.
To start off, could you tell us how you got into journalism?
When I was a student in Edinburgh, a long time ago, I started to think about journalism as a career, and what I think excited me about it was the idea of being present at historic moments, the idea of having a seat in the front row of history, the idea of being a chronicler of the age that I was living through and trying to understand it as events were unfolding. I remember one very sort of formative time, if you like, was when I was in my third of 4 years as a student, and there was a military coup in Poland. General Jaruzelski seized power in the winter of 1980-81 and 81-82. I remember there was one BBC correspondent who was still in the country at the time. The borders were closed, no journalists could get in, but he was living there, and he was on our TV screens every lunchtime and every evening with an update on what was unfolding. It was incredibly dramatic to me, the idea of a military coup in Europe, even in communist Europe as it was then, still a divided country. And I remember thinking, God, I envy that guy. What an exciting thing to live through, what an exciting thing to witness. And I would never have believed back then I would go on to interview General Jaruzelski in my own career and get to know the man who I saw on television at that time as a colleague. So really that was, I remember the excitement, the idea of being present at moments of history filled me with excitement when I was about 20 or 21, and that's really when I got hooked on the idea.
Obviously, a topic extremely prevalent in the news today is the result of the American presidential election that took place last week. And as a BBC special correspondent in Moscow, you obviously have a deep understanding of Russia. Mm-hmm. What effect do you think the future Trump administration will have on U.S.-Russia relations?
Well, I think it's impossible to tell what kind of president Donald Trump will be, because he didn't have a very developed policy platform during the election. He said a lot of things that seemed made up on the hoof, things that reflected his own attitudes. But I think if I were Ukrainian or Latvian or Lithuanian or Estonian, I'd be pretty worried about that. And I think that one of the things that will be of concern, especially in Central Europe, in Poland and Germany, is the idea of a pact between the United States and Russia, which will allow Russia free rein in territories that many Russians still regard as their legitimate sphere of interest, in countries that are young democracies or attempting to democratize and attempting to embrace what we traditionally think of as Western values. I think they will start to feel abandoned. The danger is that they will start to feel abandoned by America. And one of the things that it makes me think about quite seriously is the fact that throughout my lifetime, I was born at the tail end of the 1950s, so the tail end of post-war austerity. One of the constants in my lifetime has been the idea of America as a sheet anchor of democratic values. And whether that will sustain is now an open question for the first time in my life. America's commitment to defending democratic values around the world is now open to question. So I'd be worried if I were Ukrainian or Polish or Lithuanian or especially Latvian.
Thank you. We now turn to the situation in the Middle East, where the offensive to retake Mosul is in full swing. As a BBC reporter in Kuwait and Baghdad during the Gulf War, you obviously have a profound understanding of the situation in the Middle East. Gaddafi's death in 2011 resulted in a power vacuum in Libya. What effect do you think this vacuum, how important do you think this vacuum was in allowing ISIS to grow and become the threat that it is today?
Well, I think the bedrock of ISIS support is Iraq and Syria. That's where it's strongest and most entrenched. But it's strong in Libya as well. And I think clearly it was the preconditions for the growth of ISIS were there before Gaddafi fell. And the most important precondition was the simple fact that in some ways Gaddafi's Libya was not really a state at all, it was a family. And there was no civil society, there were no institutions of civil society, no real institutions of state governance in Gaddafi's Libya, it really was a family dictatorship. And once you removed that, there was nothing to fall back on. And so it wasn't very surprising that Libya then fragmented. And one of the, I think, mistakes that was made in the Western intervention in Libya was not preparing for the aftermath, was not understanding the nature of Libyan society and the lack of an effective state. And Libya is a place of fierce localisms. I mean, it was a country held together by the Gaddafi dictatorship, and it was predictable that it was going to split, not along sectarian lines. There was no real sectarian division, as in Sunni Shia, but there were strong tribal divisions. And so it was predictable that it was going to split, and that there would be a vacuum into which ISIS could grow. And in fact, a lot of Gaddafi's supporters, at the time he was trying to hold on to power, predicted it, and they turned out to be right.
And now we turn to the issue of Scotland's independence. How likely do you think a second Scottish independence referendum is following Britain's decision to leave the EU?
I don't think it's very likely to automatically follow on from that decision. However, I think there will be one in the end. I think it's increasingly unlikely that it'll be in the next couple of years. I think it's increasingly unlikely that it will take place before Britain has left the EU. I think the decision to leave the EU makes Scottish independence in the end probably more likely, but paradoxically more difficult. Because I think there is a long-term movement in that direction that started really arguably in the 1980s, and the two countries, England and Wales on the one hand and Scotland on the other, have been diverging, moving in separate directions. And the EU referendum, the difference in the result in Scotland and in England and Wales, is an illustration of how different the two countries are now, rather than a cause of another Scottish referendum. I think the plain truth is the opinion polls don't show any significant movement from the result of the 2014 election, which was 45-55. I know that Alex Salmond, the former First Minister, believes that if another referendum were to be called in the next year to 18 months, that they would win it. Nicola Sturgeon, who's the First Minister now, on the other hand, is much more cautious. She knows very well that she can't afford to call a second referendum and lose that, because if that happens, the question really is over for a very long time. So my guess would be that she'll wait until we get the terms of the Brexit decision. The effect on Scotland's economy will become clearer. But I think in the long run, the two countries are diverging in terms of their values, the kind of vision they have for the future. England and Wales more keen to look outside the EU, more keen on a sort of global future, if that's possible. And Scotland much more European in its orientation. So I suspect that in the long run we're moving in that direction, but I don't think the EU referendum result will have the effect that many predicted. In other words, propelling Scotland much more quickly in that direction.
Thank you. There were accusations of the BBC being biased during the Scottish independence referendum. Do you think the BBC is as neutral as it claims to be?
You know, there are problems with these terms, objectivity, neutrality and impartiality and balance. They're not always the same thing. And I think let me give you an example. If you go into a bar or a cafe, and there's one man arguing very passionately and with great conviction that 2 + 2 = 4, and the other one is arguing with equal conviction and passion that 2 + 2 = 6. It's never right to say the truth lies somewhere in between, because manifestly it doesn't. You have to make a judgment about the quality of evidence upon which each assertion is made. I don't think the BBC was biased during the Scottish referendum campaign. I think a lot of awkward facts, a lot of awkward opinions, a lot of awkward projections, a lot of awkward assertions were made which had to be aired, which needed answers. I think the Yes campaign, the pro-independence campaign, was tremendously brave and foresight, had real foresight. They produced a 600-page document about what an independent Scotland would look like. We didn't have anything like that in Brexit. There weren't 600 words on what a Brexit Britain would look like, never mind 600 pages. But because they did that, there were lots of hostages to fortune in there. Lots of things that could be picked apart and criticised and analysed, and that had to be done. It was so I think the BBC played an important role in what was a very healthy and positive campaign. It's certainly a much healthier and more positive campaign than the Brexit one that came 2 years later.
Yeah, thank you. And now we turn to the general topic of journalism. Do you think there is still a place for mainstream media in the age of social media?
I think the role of mainstream media is more important than ever in the age of social media, because what's very clear now is that a very large proportion of people are getting their news from social media, and social media has become an echo chamber which reflects your own views back to you as though they're mainstream. And the space that we stand in, the public square that we pass through in the course of our everyday lives, in which we expect to encounter views that are different from our own, or views with which we disagree, or views which we find offensive, is diminishing rapidly. So people are retreating to silos in which all they hear are the views they already hold, and they hear stories and assertions and opinions which reinforce those views. And especially in America now, there are really two Americas emerging, and staring at each other in mutual incomprehension across an ever-widening gulf. And not only has America lost the habit of talking to itself, these two Americas no longer have the habit of talking to each other and listening to each other. They no longer have the means by which they might listen to each other, because the mainstream media is so diminished and has become the preserve of one of those Americas, the old liberal America. And so I'm very worried about that. I think the idea of a pluralist society, the idea where we're all comfortable living in a society where people disagree with us and we respect their right to disagree with us, that is in danger now, because people are only exposed now, or many people are only exposed to views with which they agree, and they increasingly find views of other people abhorrent or offensive, instead of living in a society which is founded on the assumption that there will be a plurality of understanding, that there are many ways to see the world, that there are many ways to aspire to a better world. So I think the idea of a public square where you expect to encounter people who disagree with you is more vital than ever now. And so I think there's a more urgent role for the mainstream media than ever.
Allan Little, thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.